last week we spoke about K Dorsey cigars, and I'd already declared an interest to Stephen that this week I wanted to go on to Trinidad. Now, Trinidad Cigars. Now, the
Yeah.
rationale for that was that, again, referring back to last week, I'd heard some gossip and rumor that K Dorsey would become part of this elite super brand where Trinidad and Cohiba already sit. So I thought it would be
Right.
a natural progression to go on to Trinidad Cigars, right? And then the stories started playing in my head. The sort of like the history of Trinidad cigars. I mean, I did a little bit of research, but at the same time, the curiosity of this brand, I will explain now. So, do you want to cue the credit?
I just cued him when you took your last break. We're good. We're ready to roll. I'm about to light my cigar. I went through what I'm smoking. We
So,
made fun of
light up.
you. And
Now,
are you lighting up?
Trinidad cigars have
Yeah.
some sort of mythic element to them. Um, I'm not 100% convinced whether they are mythic, whether it's part of the marketing, whether it's part of the story. But if you combine all these things together, you get the anticipation of something quite special, which is what these Habanos people in Cuba have managed to do really well. One of the sort of upselling aspects of Cuban cigars, apart from the fact that they're ridiculously good products,
Mm.
is the sort of the brand upsell, the sort of the exploration of the history of Partagas or Trinidad or
Right.
Quai d'Orsay, which is the thing that I think interests me quite a lot. That's what makes me want to smoke a cigar if I already know something about it.
Right.
So now Trinidad Cigars, apparently there is a pre-story, there's a prequel to this. If we want to stick to a timeline element, there was a small factory in Cuba around 1903 called Trinidad y Hermanos, Trinidad and Brothers, run by a guy called Diego Trinidad. And he would produce a certain sort of panatella cigar, which are these thin cigars, and cigarettes. And this factory apparently vanished after a while. There's a lot of up and down with sort of these the small producers, etc., etc., etc. And that kind of name that disappeared. This is going towards history books right now. Now, the next time this word Trinidad reared its head was around 1969-ish, when these unbanded Trinidad diplomatic cigars were produced in small batches for basically Fidel Castro to give away to high-end diplomatic dignitaries around the world. So, for example, he's got a present, sort of a Cuban-made, homemade present that when he travels to, I don't know, to China or to Paris or whatever, he gives this as a present. Okay. Now, these cigars were in plain boxes, and I think these were boxes of 100. Now, God knows if he gave boxes away or single sticks, God knows, but they were not for sale. This was sort of a secret brand, it wasn't a brand, it was a secret stack that was produced in small batches, about 2,000 cigars a month in boxes of 100, so only like 20 boxes a month. And Fidel Castro gave these away as diplomatic presents. And for the longest period of time, you could not buy these cigars. Okay. And eventually, just to move forward, eventually they went into some sort of formal production around 1998. Okay. But we'll come to that in a little while. Now, when you have something, a product such as a cigar, especially a Cuban cigar, and it would have been throughout the 70s and throughout the 80s, through sort of like the period of global capitalism, where a cigar was a symbol both of capitalism and communism. They're quite, a mixture there. A cigar with no band on it, or sort of a hidden cigar that only would be presented to you from Fidel Castro in a box, which probably would have his signature on it, became something of a talking piece or a talking point. Now, really, the thing that interests me, or this about this cigar, is my recollection is that given that my grandfather on my mother's side was a senior diplomat in Pakistan, so sort of throughout the late 60s, throughout the 70s and 80s, into the 90s, I remember him smoking these cigars with my father. And at some stage in the mid 80s to late 80s, that's my recollection. I suspect some of these boxes, empty boxes, are stashed in his library, which still exists today. So that's a story that kind of ties in with me at some stage. But the more fascinating uplift to this story is that the owner of Cigar Aficionado magazine, Marvin Shanken, in 1994 organized what he termed as Dinner of the Century, which was basically a gathering of bon vivants and rich people in Paris in a restaurant called Laurent in sort of like the north of Paris, not too far from the Arc de Triomphe. And this gathering was about cigars, fine food, um, fine dining, and fine networking. And it is this, and it was an event that was opened with these Trinidad cigars. They were auctioned during that event. They went for ridiculous prices, even at that time, something like £500 a stick. But that story has become part of the mythos of cigar smokers, notwithstanding the fact that it was marketed by a guy that ran a magazine to market cigars. So now, reading between the lines, you have to work out how much of this is fluff, how much of it's smoke and mirrors. Fidel Castro did not attend that event, but those cigars were there, and there was some excellent wines. I think Francis Ford Coppola was there; his wines were there, etc. The lunch or dinner was the dinner was organized by Alain Ducasse, one of the most famous French chefs, and there was no end of beautiful wines and pairings and Cohiba cigars after the Trinidad cigars. But that set a bit of a benchmark for auction. So because some of these boxes were auctioned during the dinner for the charity in Cuba, so I think it was a medical charity to help people in hospitals, etc. And those prices those cigars went for were ridiculous. And sort of jump another 4 years after that, sort of 1998, there was already some talk of preparation of releasing these cigars into the market. And eventually they did, with the first release of those cigars being sort of a Fundadores, which is a slightly wider ring gauge than the original unbanded cigars. They were 38 ring gauge, Fundadores 40 ring gauge. And the Trinidad cigar range has this distinctive ponytail on the top of the cap, which is where the Fundadores started, and all their cigars are like this. That interesting, for me, interesting, that sort of mythic history about Trinidad cigars has not only influenced how people smoke these cigars, but the prices people pay for these cigars and the relish with which people run towards these super brands like Trinidad and Cohiba. So that is my very brief little introduction into something that was quite luxurious. Again, tied in with France in terms of fine dining, fine pairing, and sort of a Cuba France kind of thing going on there. And I thought I would share that with you.